let's start with our topic for today. So our topic for today was setting boundaries, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. Um, so there are many kinds of boundaries, of course, boundaries between different people and different relationships and different roles. So what we'll do today is we'll just talk about one boundary, which is the couple boundary, husband and wife, or significant other. The reason for this is because we don't have enough time to go talk about all the boundaries. So let's just talk about one. So one thing about the husband-wife boundary. So sometimes, spouses find that, their spouse is behaving more like their child, and that they are also treating their spouse more like their child. Okay. So I'm not going to say man or woman because I think that just ticks off some people. So, let's just be aware that there is a masculinity and there's a femininity. And if you go with Master Choa Kok Sui's school, what we realize is that we need to maintain boundaries. So how do we maintain boundaries in the pranic healing system? One of the ways that I have understood is that we do it by cutting cords. So let's just talk about this for a few minutes. There is a legitimate relationship between two people, but sometimes we cross those legitimate relationships. So what I mean by that is that, let's say, for example, a husband is getting very, or anybody, like one spouse is getting very clingy on the other person. Now, when we are children below the age of, let's say, 3 or 4, at that point, it's okay to cling to our parent or to cling to somebody. But as we become older and older, especially as we become teenagers, it's expected that we are going to not be clingy after that, right? But if the person continues to be clingy, then they continue to be clingy to their spouse, then they continue to be clingy to their children, and then they just continue to be a clingy person, right? So in pranic healing, the way we deal with that is that we basically cut unauthorized cords. So if you are a healer, then you know what I'm talking about. If you've done the basic pranic healing workshop, if you haven't done the basic pranic healing workshop, then perhaps it's time to do it, so you can understand how it's done. Now, one of the other things that I feel about boundaries is just about communication. So let's say, for example, I've offered to do something for someone, but then instead of holding a finger, they're actually trying to grab all of me. So to me, that also involves setting boundaries. So of course, on the energy level, like I said, we can cut cords, but on the physical level also, I think it also takes a certain amount of awareness. Awareness in the form of, are we crossing certain boundaries with people? So let's say between like a spouse, for example, if let's say if a spouse takes things that belong to another spouse. So, people assume that everything belongs to everyone. That's not always true. Some things belong to us and some things belong to our partner. And we just need to be aware of that, and we need to create that. We need to create that boundary, because, initially when people are in love, then they're like, oh, whatever I have is yours. That works for a very short time. In life, it doesn't really work later. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that we begin to treat people badly. I'm just saying we develop the awareness of our own and the other. So if you look at it again in the energy system, we have an aura, the other person has an aura. Okay. So today, when two auras are mixing or two auras are sitting together, that's okay, because they have decided to sit together. But if those two auras are never separated from each other and they're not aware of the separation between them, that's when we have a problem. So let's say, for example, I have my work, and let's say my husband is, he's not here right now, but anyway, let's just say the spouse is continuously, interfering. So, it's like my work is my work, and you need to kind of stick to your work. The other way that I feel that we can handle boundaries in spouse relationships is to kind of divide up. And this can be for any relationship, okay? Even for a parent, even for a family living together, all of that is fine. But the point is that we just need to decide who's going to handle what. So let's say, for example, I say that, okay, all the male domestic help needs to be handled by you, and all the female domestic help needs to be handled by me. Okay, that's one option. Then the other options are who's going to handle, let's say, you know, the work, the workplace, stuff in the house, who's going to handle that. So sometimes with couples, it's like, let's say for example, they have a child and they need to work with the child. What we'll find is that both parents are, you know, kind of, you know what I mean, just jumping on the child and giving instructions and co-instructions. But setting boundaries to me involves, you know, two people deciding that, okay, I'm going to handle this part of the relationship with the child and you're going to handle this part of the relationship with the child. Because, you know, if both parents start to like nag the child simultaneously, then that doesn't usually work. So to me, that, you know, setting boundaries to me is a very, very broad topic. So I'm just trying to cover something in the context of a husband-wife relationship or a couple relationship. So let's say, for example, you know how sometimes if I say if one person says something to the other person, you know, outside the couple, then they find that the third person tends to listen to one person between these two. Okay. Now, instead of going on an ego tiff about it, we can just be like, okay, fine. This person responds better to you. So why don't you handle everything related to this person in the family? And I'll handle everything related to that person in the family. Right. So we're just kind of dividing up. So to me, setting boundaries is a lot about just deciding who's going to do what and then not interfere in that space. Okay, so I don't know if this is, making sense to you, but because, you know, sometimes we see people like I saw this one lady actually. She said that her children won't eat if she doesn't go home. And I was like, okay, that's fair. So then I just happened to ask, like, how old are your children? And I remember she said, my daughter is 16 and my son is 18. Ooh, I was like, okay, this is not a good situation, right? Because the boundary, so to say, between the mother and the child has not been set properly, right? The other thing that we have in boundaries is, let's say, for example, if somebody comes and borrows, so let's say my spouse borrows my charger and they don't give it back, we need to say something about it. Okay. And we need to be clear that, okay, you're taking my things, that's okay, but it needs to come back into my space. Okay. So there are many, many levels of boundary setting. There's physical boundary, there's emotional boundary, there's a mental boundary, and there's a spiritual boundary. So let's talk about the mental boundary a little bit. The mental boundary to me is sharing of ideas. You know, how many times has it happened that one person in the family thinks something and that person expects everybody else to think the same way? Doesn't happen, right? So the way I suggest handling these things is I usually will tell people in the family that, okay, that's your opinion. I see it differently. And if you want, I can discuss how I feel. Okay. So in this reference, I wanna just add, there is a resource called Dan O'Connor. I listen to a lot of his stuff in communication. So his name is Dan O'Connor. He's on YouTube. So this is one thing I learned from one of his videos where he said that, you know, often people say, you know, let's agree to disagree. That's a very combative statement. Okay, that means like you and I are still at war because we are agreeing to disagree. So it's like, okay, let's just like not talk about it. But when we say something a little differently, so in this case, the sentence that he suggests is that you can say, I see things differently. Would you like to talk about it? So what you're saying is that, yes, you're right, but I also have a different perspective. So again, you know, that's what I call like setting mental boundaries, where you don't necessarily have to agree with everything that everyone is saying, but you can just set your space and you can set your boundary. The other place, of course, is spiritual, where, let's say, for example, I've seen when people get married, for example, then they sometimes change their religion, which is okay with, you know, it's fine if they want to change their religion. But personally, for me, I feel that not that religion is spirituality, but if there is a spiritual belief that one partner has, then we need to also let our partner have a different belief. Now, obviously, we are not here to lecture our partners. We are here to talk about ourselves. So let's say, for example, if I had a situation where my spouse thought differently. Like my spouse, for example, did not believe in pranic healing for the longest time. He in fact was like, what are you doing? And then once he saw changes in me, that is when he was like, oh, okay, this stuff works. And then now, of course, today he's practicing Arhatic yogi, and he's done Kriya Shakti and everything else. So again, sometimes you have to like set your boundaries as an adult. Now, one thing about boundaries we have to be aware is that, are we in a relationship where instead of being a spousal relationship, it has become an adult-child relationship? So that's something to always watch out for. There's a lot of books on psychology which you can read to understand some of these things. The other thing to keep in mind is that people tend to pick a spouse that is very much like their parent or a complete opposite of that parent. So let's say I'm a woman, my tendency, okay, not always, but my tendency would be to choose a man who is either very much like my father or not at all like my father. Okay, so again, these are things to keep in mind when we are setting boundaries, because sometimes what happens is that we begin to, because we married somebody who we thought was very much like our father, what we tend to do is we tend to impose those emotions on that person. And that's not fair, because that person is a different person. Okay, so that's kind of all that I wanted to say about setting boundaries. Like I said, there's a lot of psychology about this, but to me personally, pranic healing provides a lot of solutions. I've seen that when we do the forgiveness prayer, I've seen that when we do twin hearts meditation and we bless the person, and of course, when we cut cords, I've noticed that the boundaries begin to reset themselves automatically. So you can use that, or you can use, other paths to get there. So one more thing about boundaries is the aura. We need to be aware that we have an aura. And if you read books by Arthur Powell, then you have an etheric body, you have an astral body, and you have a mental body, right? And you also have a causal body. Now, to me, each of these are also some sort of energetic boundaries. So you can read the books by Arthur Powell to understand this. Of course, when we do pranic healing, we work on those, we work on the aura. Those of you who've done pranic healing, we do something to repair the aura and to make it strong. So that also energetically restores the boundary. Okay. Thank you so much for joining our session. And like I said, we have basic pranic healing coming up, and we have the self-healing workshop also coming up online. So whichever one you want to do. See you.